I went with a delicate cream blouse. No one had asked me to iron it, but I did it the previous evening. It reminded me of blouses women wore to Sunday tea because of its delicate collar and tiny mother-of-pearl buttons down the front. Even though not many people iron today, I still find solace in the sound of steam and the press of heated fabric. It creates the appearance that something is being fixed. I got up earlier than the sun on the morning of the wedding. There was silence in my home. I think this behavior dates back to the days when feeding people felt like a way to be needed because the kitchen had a subtle thyme scent from the roast I had made the night before. A sliver of gray light came in when I lifted the drapes just enough. My thoughts were awake, but the city was still asleep. I left breakfast alone, just a tea mug, grasped between both hands for stability rather than warmth. The invitation, which had ivory cardstock and calligraphy that appeared printed yet attempted to be personal, was resting on the kitchen table. I followed the edges that were embossed. It has my name on it. Seldom, Mrs. Parker, Eileen, visitor. Even if it wasn't intended to, the last word had hurt. No one contacted me to inquire about a ride. Claire, the woman he was planning to wed, was not my child. The plan was for me to arrive independently. I wore the same navy clutch I wore to funerals, along with shoes that had a small heel. Just after 9, I carefully locked the door behind me and stepped outside, smoothing the blouse against my skirt. The cabbie said very little. I'm good with that. The city I'd once held my baby in, his tiny head resting just under my chin on bus rides, his fingers entangled in the strap of my handbag, passed by as I gazed out the window. The same boy, who had grown tall and attractive, had asked me if I didn't mind sitting at the rear, not in a comfortable way. Weeks earlier, on the phone, he had stated, "You know how Claire is about photos. Mum, it's not personal. She simply wants the photos to have a specific appearance." I recall that I remained silent for a while. Shouting is not always as loud as silence. He thanked me as if I had done him a favor after I finally replied, "Of course." The space was clean, futuristic, and devoid of any warmth, with white stone and glass. It is the type of location where nothing, not even memory or smell, adheres to the walls. A young woman with a clipboard showed me to my seat with a cold, professional grin. "Just there, in the back row on the left," she added. Without adjusting the position, I thanked her and took a seat. Fathers fixing ties, couples comparing watches, mothers in pastel silk. Others came in small perfumed groups. The groom's mother was not visible at the front, according to a comment made by someone behind me. I didn't look around. Let them ponder. It was a brief ceremony, lovely, predictable. Claire strolled down the aisle as if she were walking through a magazine layout rather than as a real person. My son's smile, which he usually wears for camera flashes or job interviews, remained constant throughout. Maybe I was the only one who noticed, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He looked once toward the crowd during their vows, possibly scanning or just out of habit, and his eyes passed over mine without touching. I doubt he noticed me. Alternatively, he may have noticed me but chose not to acknowledge it. The photographer then arranged the subjects in orderly rows, much like schoolchildren. I wasn't asked to participate in any photos, not one. I hovered around a little hydrangea arrangement on a marble counter at the edge of the reception area. I acted as though I was reading the menu card. I looked over the wine list, but I decided not to order. I touched my napkin once and then folded it again. The guests clinked glasses as Claire's mother, dressed elegantly in taupe chiffon, toasted them. Since no one acknowledged me, I raised my glass as well. The audience accepted the speeches. No one ever mentioned my name. Between the appetizer and the dance, I believe I vanished. I left before they sliced the cake. No one stopped me. The travel there was louder than the cab ride back. I refrained from crying. Something inside of me had become still. Not because I didn't want to. I didn't feel completely numb. Simply composed. During the ceremony, I felt a tightening inside. I experienced a sense of constriction. It is now held. I took off the blouse when I got home and hung it up properly. There was only pale skin and a single line where the neckline had been. No lipstick smudging or makeup to wipe off. I changed into my house clothes, the cotton outfit I wear for gardenage trimming and laundry folding. On the table, the invitation was still there. Again, I took it up and flipped it over. No private message. Only the RSVP line that I returned via letter a month ago. I had checked yes. I thought it would matter. Not because I wanted to go, that there would be significance in my presence. I took a tiny pale envelope out of the drawer next to the kitchen. A picture of my 8-year-old kid grinning while holding a crooked cake we prepared for his school bake sale was inside. Food dye had coated his fingers. I also had my hands in the picture, supporting the plate. It had been years since I last looked at it. I put the picture in a fresh envelope. No note was written by me. I carefully sealed it and set it next to the invitation. After that, I switched off the kitchen light and made my way upstairs, one steady step at a time. When I got to the top, I saw that I had been removed from the image. However, that did not negate my existence. And I hadn't finished yet. I gave the plants their regular watering the following morning. The geraniums on the sill were in danger of blooming out of season, and the pothos in the kitchen had gotten long enough to hang down the handles of the cupboards. Silently, I cut off the brown leaves and brushed the dirt from my fingers onto a tea towel I no longer used for visitors. The house resonated faintly, despite its diminutive size. I had become accustomed to the sound, a sort of silence that lurks in the nooks and crannies of the day and waits. My son did not make a call, not to thank me for visiting or to inquire if I had made it home safely. I didn't anticipate one. I used the sink to wash the few dishes. A spoon, a cup, one of the butter knives from the soft cheese I ate by myself prior to the wedding. As though it were a ritual, I wiped the sponge on the porcelain. The rhythm of the little things becomes your scaffolding when you live alone. You begin to see how honorable it is to sweep your own floor. Then I unlocked the sideboard's little drawer. It gave a gentle, wooden sigh after becoming slightly stuck, as it always did. Items that hadn't been touched in years were found within. A birthday card written in a childish style. One of the buttons I intended to sew onto a long-discarded coat. A recipe written in my mother's script on a folded piece of paper. All commonplace, yet they caused silence to descend upon the room. A card from Matthew's 21st birthday was tucked away at the far back. That year, I had written more than usual. I'd slipped him a check and a brief note expressing my pride in him and his development into a self-sufficient. He had texted me a simple thank you. It wasn't a call, no visit. I believed that he had found it easier to regard me as a supporting character, someone little and gentle, easy to overlook. Halfway through, I shut the drawer, then stopped. Beneath the folded apron was another item, a piece of fabric I hadn't seen in a while. Light blue. I managed to liberate it. Before his father left, it was one of the cloth napkins from the old house. Back then, we swapped jokes across the table as if they were sacred, had matching sets, and had Christmas feasts with place cards. When he was older, Matthew would sit cross-legged on a chair and talk about space, dinosaurs, and how he would build me a rocket. I trusted him. The material was pushed between my palms. Unlike thunder, grief does not announce itself. It comes in linens, loose laces, and drawers that don't close all the way. It comes in gentle waves. It resides in the odor of the past and in the way that memories can sweep one another along with them like a wave. I sensed the flood rising that day. I prepared a simple meal for myself, a relic from childhood, cheese and tomato on toast with the crusts removed. As I ate carefully, I noticed the neighbor's cat snuggled up in a spot of sunlight outside the kitchen window. Life continued. Due to my courteous removal from the planet, it did not pause. I opened the little envelope with the picture that I had made the previous evening after lunch. I didn't include a note. I didn't have to. A child's happiness speaks louder than a mother's contrition. Nevertheless, I questioned whether he would open it. If Claire would just throw it away. It would be meaningless in a life too perfect for flaws if it were buried under unopened mail. Once more, I sealed it, this time firmer. I paused at the corner postbox and then slipped it in. That sound, the gentle metallic clunk as it fell, had a definitive quality. I lingered there longer than I should have, unaware that I had just mailed a piece of myself. A man with a stroller passed me and nodded courteously. I switched on the radio when I got home, something I hadn't done in weeks. Something slow and painful was played on a classical station. It might have been a cello or a viola covered in snow. The sort of music that bridges the gaps between ideas. I picked up my knitting and sat on the edge of the couch, letting it play. I didn't want to create anything, but because my hands felt relaxed by the beat. I became aware of something that was catching in my chest as I looped the yarn. The wedding wasn't the only event. It was the gradual elimination over many years. The birthdays that are forgotten, the calls were replaced by text messages. I had subtly changed from being his mother to becoming an afterthought in his life. From anchor to annoyance. I refrained from crying. I refrained from sighing. Rather, I continued knitting, the thread flowing gently through my fingers as I completed each loop. I didn't turn on the porch light that evening. As I had started to do, let the house rest in the dark. Between stitch and quiet, I started to make the decision that I was done waiting. Not for a thank you or a seat at the table. He can't even recall who showed him how to hold a spoon for the first time. The phone didn't ring for 3 days. I had just come back from a quick morning stroll to the corner grocery store where I buy little items that I could do without. It was a lemon, some parsley, and a can of sardines that day, which I probably wouldn't open. It's not about necessity. It's about letting the storekeeper know your identity and allowing someone to still inquire. The usual, Mrs. Parker. When the first ring rang, I had just placed the bag on the counter. The phone, not the doorbell. Not to mention the landline. I was a little surprised. It is no longer widely used. I maintain it because hearing a genuine ring, not a buzz or jingle, but a legitimate call, has a certain respect. I took my time responding. I allowed it to ring twice more before picking it up and saying my name like I normally do. Eileen speaking, a pause occurred. Then a fast, flat voice said, "Hey, Mum." "Matthew." His voice sounded impersonal, as if he were calling from a train platform or a hallway where echo was present. I barely heard his voice as it passed by. I waited to hear more from him. I simply wanted to make sure, to express gratitude for your presence. His remarks sounded condensed, similar to paying off a loan. "Thank you," I replied. One more pause. A kettle or the hum of a television could have been the faint background noise I heard. "You made it home safely?" He must have known it previously, yet he asked. He would have inquired 2 days sooner if he had genuinely wondered. "Yes, I did." "All right, well, anyhow," Claire was saying, "I am aware that it wasn't perfect. It was there. It was the closest thing he could do to an apology. From the way he faded off, I could hear it. The guilt is attempting to emerge, but is evaporating." I said, "It was a lovely wedding," since I was at a loss for words. With a little hesitation, he added, "She really appreciated that you understood. About the seating." He definitely did. Then there was a silence between us, not a shouted or angry one, but the type that expresses all neither of us dared to. I gave it some leeway. I've discovered that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Eventually, he remarked, "I should go. I just wanted to check in." I could imagine him saying that as he was already reaching for something else, like his car keys, a coffee mug, or whatever else needed to be fixed. "Obviously," I said. "Be careful." Before I could say anything further, he hung up. I held the receiver for a little longer before putting it back in the cradle. Once more, the house was silent. The hum from the refrigerator also seemed to be gentler, as if it knew not to bother anyone. I placed the lemon next to the older ones in the fruit bowl after taking a peek at it in the grocery bag. I then carefully put the can of sardines at the back of the cupboard after picking it up. In the same silence, The remainder of the day went by. Despite the sky's indecision, I did the laundry, just a few pieces, and pinned them outside. Raining, but gray. I enjoy observing the fabric's movement in the wind. It gives the house a living appearance. I considered the word embarrassment as I was pinning the hem of a hand towel. It lingered there, unsaid, even though he hadn't used it during the call. He had told me to stay in the rear that day, as if I were something that might cause the picture to wrinkle. It's not horrible enough to exclude completely, not quite appropriate for the front, though. I had frequently questioned why I was the kind of mother one hides. I had never become involved. I hadn't made any demands. Again and again, I created space. Nevertheless, I had somehow turned into a liability. Or perhaps I just made him think of a past version of himself that he didn't want to go back to. I took a little box out of my closet that evening. They were in a trunk under the stairs, not the old photo albums. There was more to this. Clippings were within. Whether they admit it or not, all mothers keep them. Excerpts from school publications, pictures from plays at the community theater. Best Mom was written in pencil on a paper medal he had created in year 3. It was in my palm. Time had yellowed the tape and smeared the edges. It was heavier than memory and lighter than a feather. I refrained from crying. I just set it down next to my drink on the table and sat motionless for a while, observing the windows, hearing the clock in the adjacent room tick away, considering how things change. We bring them up, we share our good towels, our problems, and our mornings with them. Then we become inconvenient one day. However, I had lost interest in shrinking, and now the silence had strength. When napkins are folded, in the shopkeeper's mouth, my name was repeated. I had sent the envelope with no expectations. The woman at the back of the room was no longer me. The only person who saw everything from there and recalled it was me. The following morning was windy. A solitary sheet of yesterday's mail drifted beneath the kitchen door. The edge of a garden tarp and the newspaper someone neglected to weigh down were all lifted by that persistent breeze. It wasn't a storm. I stooped to pick it up and held it for a second longer than I should have. It was an insulation pamphlet for roofs. It nearly made me chuckle. A warmer home wasn't necessary for me. A talk that didn't end in silence was what I needed. A picture I didn't have to look at from the back. I filled the kettle and put the flyer in the paper bin. 1 cup, the same mug, the same tea bag. It was a minor ritual, but that morning something felt different. Clearer, but not lighter. The clarity that follows a wound ceasing to sting and settling into the skin. I heard the garden gate latching halfway through my tea. The usual click was followed by 2 brief creaks of the wood swinging back, followed by the metal catching slightly before giving way. It had been months since I had heard that sound. I gently got up and went to the window. I could see someone standing just beyond the path through the lace curtain, a figure uncertain with something in both hands. I didn't identify her right away. Claire. I remained motionless. She had not yet seen me, or perhaps she had but was acting as though she hadn't. She donned a pair of heels that weren't appropriate for my cobblestone walkway and a coat that was too delicate for the wind. The coat was cream in color, much like the invitation card. After a few moments of inaction, she raised a pallid envelope. I was moved by that. She had come herself, not because I was afraid it may be the picture, which I already knew it was. Although I opened the door, I remained inside. She spun around, a bit too eagerly. "Mrs. Parker," she said. No warmth, only a name. "I was in the vicinity. I intended to give this back." She held the envelope in front of me as if it were delicate. I refused to accept it. "Didn't you open it?" She made a line with her lips. "We did. I was shown it by Matthew." I gave one nod. "And?" As though anticipating an interruption, she looked over her shoulder. "It was sweet." Once more that word, nice, like a kid's painting or a favor from an elderly person who is too old to comprehend its significance. I said, still not crossing the threshold, "I wasn't expecting you, Claire moved a little. Matthew has been pondering, regarding the wedding, regarding the way things were handled. One more pause. I gave it to her. She then added, he is aware that it wasn't ideal. He's been experiencing some. I guess I am guilty. It was there. Guilt disguised as civility. And you? Quietly, I inquired. She blinked. Me? Indeed. Have you too been experiencing guilt? Claire took a while to respond. She gripped the envelope with slightly tighter fists. I didn't mean to hurt you, she finally said. I smiled at her a little, the kind I give when I don't think there's much to argue about. That does not imply that it did not. Softer now, she remarked. I just wanted the day to be perfect. I remarked, perfect doesn't have to mean spotless. Real things aren't flawless. Then, as though the stones in my path suddenly caught her attention, she looked down. The edge of her coat was raised by the breeze. I had yet to take the envelope. She held it in her palms as if she was awaiting permission to give it back. She remarked, he said you had mailed it, that you simply threw it in without leaving a note. I didn't believe a note was necessary. Once more, silence. The wind blew between us, she finally murmured. I should go, and took a step back. I occasionally laid the post on the bench next to the door, and she put the mail there. He wishes to stop by, soon. I didn't respond. Without saying another word, she nodded slightly, both to herself and to me, and left through the gate. I bided my time till the latch clicked once more. I then went outside and took a seat next to the envelope. The paper had not yet been folded. She hadn't crumpled it in her hands or folded. I knew what was inside, yet I opened it again, the picture, my hands steadying the plate, Matthew's smile, and the wobbly cake. This time, looking at it didn't hurt. It just lay there, a moment saved, a truth unaffected by the course of events. I returned inside after leaving it on the bench. The sky had clouded over by midday. I put out my sewing basket, because I've always found solace in the rhythm of thread passing through fabric, not because anything needed to be fixed, in a world that had far too frequently rendered me invisible. Every stitch was a decision, and every knot was a tiny act of control. I left the picture where she had put it that night. I wanted them to be curious about my next move. There was no visit the following day. There was no knock on the door. Not a single automobile sitting at the curb. No more hesitant phone calls with apologies. That's what I expected. Claire and those like her make appearances rather than make amends. And my son, well, Matthew has always been good at waiting for the right opportunity. It was something I used to excuse and then forget. Now I just watched it. A pattern with no duty left in it is similar to seeing a bird return to an empty feeder. I sat in the chair near the window in the front room all afternoon. It was the exact spot where Matthew would color on the rug or apply stickers to the glass. As I sat with a book on my lap, that day I didn't read. I merely observed. The neighbors arrived and departed. The hydrant was too close to a delivery van. Once more, the postman was late. I took note of everything, not because it was important, but because being made little makes you more perceptive. You begin to notice instead of expecting. The envelope was still weighted under a little flat stone that I had set there the previous evening on the bench outside. I thought to let the wind pull at it. Let the sky be threatening to rain. I wasn't trying to save it. Prior to being appreciated, some items have to be made public. I prepared scones at about 3, for myself and no one else. The sort with a touch of orange peel and currants. Using my fingertips, I worked the butter into the flour just as my mother had done. Warm, familiar, and unmerited, the scent permeated the kitchen like a memory. I polished the silver teapot while they baked. Not for business. Not because I was expecting a visitor, but because I wanted the space to have a lovely element, a reminder that honor could shine even in silence. In the evening, the sky took on a gentle lavender hue that is only seen in late fall. The sort of light that causes shadows to blend together, as if everything is becoming just a bit softer to make everything tolerable. Slowly and deliberately, I brought the scones to the table and ate 2 with honey. No music, no TV. The ticking of the clock alone served as a reminder that I was still here. When I heard the knock, it was after dark. Nor quick nor sharp. 3 gentle taps. When I opened the door, Matthew was standing there. He was waiting for the door to open so he wouldn't have to knock again, standing on my front step like he often did after school with his knapsack draped over one shoulder. However, he was now older and more worn out, and our quiet had matured as well. "Hello, Mom," he said. "Hi, Matthew." He looked at the photos still on the bench. "Didn't you bring it in?" "No," a pause. "I doubted you would still desire it." I didn't respond. Instead, I moved slightly to expose his face to the porch light. He paused, then entered. As if unsure whether to stay, he delicately folded his coat over his arm and removed it gradually. There was silence in the house. Not because I choose to, but because the noise that used to fill my house has long ago left. But he also seemed to notice. He stood close to the door and remarked, "I should have called sooner. Following the nuptials." I gave him a fair glance. "Indeed, you ought to have." His nod was not defensive, it was simply muted, a man beginning to realize how absent he is. "I didn't think it would." He paused, then resumed. "Claire believed that keeping the images basic was preferable. You know, a specific aesthetic, clean lines. I gave that more weight than I ought to have. I went back to sit in the window chair. And Matthew, what were your thoughts?" He appeared uncertain. "That I would destroy the symmetry?" I inquired. I spoke quietly, not resentful, simply, "Be steady." "No," he uttered rapidly. "Not destroy, simply put. I thought you wouldn't give a damn." Somehow that was more painful than the seating arrangement. "Did you really think I wouldn't mind getting deleted?" He flinched. "I'm not sure, I suppose I thought." He stopped himself once more, but this time I wasn't the one who was silent. It was his, burdened with responsibility. I said, "I've always tried to make things easy for you. I made room. I didn't bother you. When you requested, I took the back seat. Rather than creating a situation, I mailed a picture." Now he sat with his elbows on his knees, opposite me. "I understand," he muttered. I gave him a look. "But Matthew, here's the point. I was present. Long before your life needed to be organized, it was in the front, middle, and sides." His eyes lowered and he nodded. A long pause ensued. "I've been thinking about that photo," he added. I didn't respond. "I recall that day. You permitted me to tint the icing with so much blue food coloring. All of it was stained. You never lost your temper." I grinned a little. "I had on white. The garment was damaged by you," he remarked. "But you smiled in the picture." I answered, "Because you were proud." In the silence that followed, we sat as two people starting to realize what had slipped between them, not as mother and son who had yet to be reconciled. At last I said, "Do you want a scone?" He raised his head. "Yes," he said. "I would." I got up, walked into the kitchen, and returned with the platter. Without a ceremony, I put it between us. We were just two folks enjoying something warm for a little while. The rest would take time, including the change, the healing, and the apology. At least the door was open. Matthew lingered for 30 minutes. If you include the one he broke in half and left whole, he had 2 scones. We never again discussed the wedding. We discussed the weather, his travel to work, and the fact that this year's leaves fell late. I posed straightforward, honest, and undemanding questions, much like moms do, and he responded with facts rather than emotion, as distant sons frequently do. I listened nonetheless. "Because I've always done it. He took the picture with him when he departed." "Would it be okay if I kept it?" he asked. I gave a nod. And that was all. "Thank you, but no." There was no reference to the envelope or the drawer from which it had been taken. "I'll call you soon," is all. With my hand still on the handle, I stood there for a long time after he closed the door. The smell of honey was still subtle, and the corridor was warm from the oven. However, the silence reappeared, this time as something more recognizable rather than as a wound. I knew how to mold that quiet. I sat with my knitting once more later that evening. I kept grounded because of the rhythm, not because it was a habit. I didn't want to get caught up in the past and believe that a visit would bring about a change. That was something I had done before. Every injured knee, unread text, and birthday without a call till the evening teach us to be hopeful mothers. However, this was not like the others. I wasn't hopeful this time. I was recalling. I recalled Matthew playing a tree, of all things, in a school concert when he was 9 years old. A cardboard branch with paper apples taped to it is held by a tree in the backdrop. I clapped louder than anybody else, but he didn't say anything. He later told me that no one else's mother had clapped like that, and that I had embarrassed him. I had expressed regret. I ought not to have. I reflected on all the small excuses I had made over the years for being too obvious, too commonplace, and too much of a reminder of his origins. However, I never requested an apology in exchange, not once. I wasn't asking now, though, because what I really needed, what I desired, wasn't a verbal apology that quickly evaporated. Something more stable, a change, a tribute. I discovered a box on the front step the following morning. Not a word. The label has no name. However, I recognized the handwriting on the brown paper. It was always a little tilted to the left and had crooked capitals. Matthew's, from his early years. He continued to write in the same style but less frequently, as if handwriting were charming and almost romantic. I carried the box inside and placed it on the table in the kitchen. It wasn't big. It took me a while to open it. I started by making tea. Bring the water to a boil. Allow the silence to permeate the space like breath. I then removed the tape. There was a frame inside, no glass, just plain wood, and the picture in it. He was the one who mounted it. I knew. The matting was a little off-center and the corners weren't precisely lined up. However, he had decided to keep it behind a frame rather than in a shoebox or drawer. As to convey, this was important. I took a seat. No note was present, no justification. However, the lack of words did not render it meaningless. It became truthful. I gazed at the frame for a while after leaving it on the table, not with anguish or tears, simply with the silent knowledge that something had changed, not fixed, not revised, but changed. I hung it in the hallway thereafter, directly across from the entrance, so that it would be the first thing someone saw when they walked in. A young boy whose hands were stained blue. An uneven cake, the solid hands of a mother behind him, no caption. Don't apologize, just for recollection, put it in a visible place. I opened the front room window that afternoon, allow the wind to enter. The lace curtain brushed the frame and flapped a little. The home felt a little less empty, but I sat on the chair as usual. The past didn't reverberate as strongly. It didn't hurt to be silent. I also didn't feel like I was waiting in the back row for the first time in a long time. I received the impression that I had been remembered. As is often the case when you cease waiting for something to arrive, the next week went by without incident. Tea in the morning, a quick stroll to the grocer or post box, and returning home before the wind picked up in the late afternoon were the routines of each day. Using an old straw broom whose bristles had started to spread out like a worn-out dress hem, I cleaned the porch on Saturday after trimming the garden hedge on Thursday. As usual, people went by, but a few times someone stopped. "I saw your boy the other day. I thought that was him," popping by, said Mrs. Bennet 3 doors down in a light, slightly nosy but not rude voice. "Yes," I said. "He wanted a scone." He grinned. "You know, it's good when they do remember to show up. Some people completely forget." She only lingered long enough to glance beyond me and into the house, seemingly attempting to gauge its potential level of occupancy. I took a seat in the window-facing chair once more after she had gone. Now the framed picture was hanging behind me in the corridor. From where I sat I couldn't see it, but I didn't have to. I was aware of its presence. That was sufficient. Small actions like a single visit or a picture in a frame have an odd way of echoing, not too loudly, just slowly. I was humming in the kitchen the day after Matthew arrived. It was only when I heard the sound that I realized I had ceased doing it. Something soft, silent. Never singing out loud, my mother would hum in the mornings while she packed our lunches. It had a sense of tranquility. I started preparing more food than I required. It was good to have something on the burner, not because I thought anyone would join me. Soup made with lentils. A shepherd's pie. Dishes that brought anything other than silence into the house. I put aside a tin and made shortbread one afternoon. There was no label on it. I simply put it next to the front hall coat rack, and I presented it to Matthew without any fanfare when he called a few days later, merely to let him know he was in town for a meeting. It felt real for the first time, and he grinned as he accepted it. Not coerced, not the result of guilt. "Did you make these when I was little?" he inquired. I said, "I still do. You simply haven't been present to observe." His grin wavered slightly. Not with embarrassment, in acknowledgement. It didn't matter that he didn't stay long. The way he had stayed close to the framed picture on his way out, genuinely looking at it, and then lightly tracing a finger down the wood's edge, was what counted. He remained silent about it, however. I took note. The neighbors did the same. Across the street I noticed Mr. Lewis repeatedly looking at my window. He nodded when we met, even though we're not really buddies, and he called over one morning as I was trimming the rose shrub by the gate. "You've had some company lately," he remarked with a hint of humor. "Occasionally," I answered. "All right," he said. "It's nice to be noticed." That stuck with me. Being visible is a positive thing, because that had been the pain behind it all, more than anything else. Not a rejection, not shame. Simply put, invisibility, a person's gradual integration into the wallpaper, the manner in which a mother fades into the background of other people's lives. However, something had changed. Not all at once, too little to put things right, but enough to make me feel that I wasn't something that should be cut out for the first time in a long time. Matthew made no promises about additional trips. He made no commitment to call he made no request to sit and reminisce about the past. However, he had arrived twice. The picture was his. It was framed by him. The shortbread tin was now in his possession, tucked under his arm as though it were his own. Little stuff. However, there are instances when nothing else matters. Before it became dark, I watered the geraniums and took a seat on the porch steps to let the last of the light fall on my hands. Hours more of silence lay ahead. Meals for one are still served. There were still nights when the phone did not ring. However, the window seat no longer seemed like a waiting area. It was like having a choice, and I believed that to be a form of peace in and of itself. Matthew never inquires for a place above. He hardly ever leaves the hallway when he comes, if he does. He enters through the front door, occasionally offering a courteous smile or a tin in return, but he never goes very far. The upper floor could be a different planet, but I frequently go up there. Not for sentimental, sorrowful, or dramatic reasons, merely because it is still in existence. A room that used to be cluttered with little items such as comic books, stray socks, and a boy's voice humming to himself before bed. Now, of course, it is quiet. It has been years. However, I keep things neat. After airing out the windows and replacing the bed linens on Sunday morning, I ended up standing in that room's threshold. His chamber. The bed is still there, though it's not as big as I recall. Along with the desk, the chair has become fragile over time. When they took his belongings after university, Claire had the posters that were attached to the walls taken down. However, I did not open one drawer in the dresser. A couple of notebooks. A football match ticket stub. He was unable to fix a broken yo-yo. I don't keep those items to grieve for him. He is still alive. Some aspects of him, however, are the youngster who penned birthday cards without grammar, and the boy who once rushed down the hall wearing socks too big for his feet. I don't sit with loss. Change is happening. I ran my fingers over the blanket, repositioned the window latch, and dusted the desk. I wasn't depressed about it, simply contemplative. There is a distinction. People assume that older ladies are exclusively depressed. However, some of us have just learned to accept the past without moving. The kettle whistled downstairs. I brought my tea to the front room after making it. The clouds were moving swiftly, and the sky was pale, as though they were unsure of the type of day they wanted to be. I enjoyed it. Uncertain skies have a more genuine sense. The phone rang as I was getting comfortable in the chair. It was immediately his voice this time, without hesitation. "I'm not sorry." "Hello, Mom, are you busy?" "No," I replied, "just took a seat." His voice was lighter than normal. Perhaps he was phoning from the vehicle. Something instrumental, possibly a piano, was playing softly in the background. He said, "I'm going your way later. I considered dropping in, if you don't mind." "It is," I answered. "Hold on, I won't be here for long." Simply said, "I thought it would be pleasant." Good. A little word, yet when used honestly, it can convey a lot. I said, "I'll turn on the kettle once more at 4 o'clock. He laughed, the small sigh he lets out when he's both appreciative and at a loss for words. "All right, it's 4. I spent some time in the chair after the call. Not because I felt overburdened, but rather because I sensed a change. In me, not in him. I was not anxious about his visit for the first time. I didn't question whether I was presentable, whether the house was too quiet, or whether I would say something that would make him feel embarrassed. I didn't prepare for unsaid tensions or practice polite conversation. I put out 2 teacups instead. Tidy, matching. The ones with the rims are like faded violets. I left it there after opening the door to his former room, not to establish anything, in case he inquired. He was on time, which was unusual for him as a child. The buttons on his coat were fresh. He had shorter hair, he had a subtle, clean herbal scent, something more subdued than aftershave. We didn't discuss anything significant. At work, he mentioned a new initiative. Claire wanted to see the movie. There was a brand new bakery next to their apartment. I offered biscuits and nodded. We didn't rush the crossing. Instead, we talked like people constructing a bridge, plank by plank. Then, as he was about to get up to go, his gaze shifted to the stairway, and he inquired, "Is my former room still upstairs?" I remained motionless. Simply replied, "Yes." One more pause. "Am I able to view it?" I nodded this time. Without saying another word, he rose, walking more slowly and softly than I had anticipated. I trailed him by a few steps, allowing him to go ahead of me, like you do when you're no longer in the lead. He paused at the doorway. He didn't smile or say anything, simply took a look around. On the bed, the dresser, the desk whose corners were flattened. He kept looking at the drawer that I had left slightly open, as though he already knew what was still inside without having to ask. "I didn't think you'd kept any of it," he remarked quietly as he turned to face me. "I saved enough." He went inside and touched the bookshelves. I picked up a toy vehicle that I didn't know was still there, its wheels still spinning and its red paint chipped. For a while we stood in that position. No show, no fancy words, nothing but silence. Then he said, "Thanks, Mum," turning to go. Not for the vehicle. For the drawer, no, just for having enough to spare. It had been years since I had shown the picture to anyone, not the framed one in the hall, which now had a place of its own and a quiet dignity. I'm referring to the little one that I always carried in my wallet, concealed behind a library card and an unupdated grocery list. Before phones, cloud storage, and organized memories, a copy was printed a long time ago. It had accompanied me for decades. Folded once, the corners are a little weathered. The hues had now faded. My blouse was no longer pure white, but ivory with time, and the icing's blue had turned more gray than dazzling, but the moment was still there. It had never been seen by Matthew. Yes, he did see the framed version that he held and the one I sent, but not this one. This one remained near, slipped behind receipts and into coat linings and zippers. It had been a part of me in the same way that actual things are, spoken, worn, and not ornamental. I took another look at my wallet after he left the house that morning. I also didn't feel protected for the first time. Not that I had lost interest in the recollection, it was that I didn't have to keep it so near anymore. It had completed its task. When I no longer knew how to speak, it had done it for me. He hadn't heard the query until he was prepared to do so. "Do you still recall who I was to you?" And maybe he did now. After taking the picture, I put it on the entryway table in a little dish. Not shown, not framed, simply put, visible. Give it some room to breathe. I headed into town that afternoon, not for anything significant, just a few potatoes, some mending thread, and a stamp I didn't need right away. As I walked up, the woman behind the counter grinned. When she spoke, her earrings would always swing. "How is your son doing?" she inquired without being asked. I must have appeared taken aback. "Did he not come in here last week?" she went on. "As I recall, I was asked about a biscuit tin. I said, a bit more slowly than usual, he did. He was here just now." "That's good," she said. "It's nice to be considered." I gave a nod. The wind increased on the way home. I tightened my scarf. I saw two young mothers at the crosswalk with coffee cups and strollers, with one child sleeping and the other crying. They brought back memories of days that seemed to go on forever but now seem to be so short. I've discovered that motherhood never ends. However, its form shifts. It gets smaller. It moves away. No one tells you that it gets quieter, and it makes you vanish if you're not careful. However, I didn't feel like I had vanished that day, not completely or continuously, but in tiny, essential ways I felt noticed. A visit. A query was posed. An open door is glanced at. The hallway smelled slightly of lemon oil from the cloth I had used earlier when I got home. The picture dish's edge was illuminated by the window's light. I took a moment to examine it once more. It was no longer painful. Later that night, I prepared another batch of lentil soup, this time with carrot, and covered it with foil. I had no idea if he would return any time soon. I had no intention of calling to inquire. Nevertheless, I put it in the refrigerator, just in case. It could be referred to as hope. However, I don't believe it is. Yes, it's habit, but there's more to it than that. A mother's instinct that endures even after it is no longer required on a daily basis. I went around the home at night, checking the windows, folding a blanket, and turning off the porch light. In the silence that ensued, I heard the clock once again, its regular beat securing the interval between the hours. I stood beside the stairs for a long time. Nothing spectacular was in store for me. No conclusion, not a handwritten apology or swelling music, only a framed picture, a memory in a dish, and a feeling of warmth in my chest that I hadn't had in a long time. Not quite forgiveness, but something like it. Return, perhaps. It was raining when Matthew last came. Not a lot of rain, just the kind that falls steadily and softly, turning the windows gray and giving the impression that everything is half asleep outside. More out of habit than expectation, I had left the porch light on, and for a brief minute I believed the knock may be the postman. However, it was him. He had a brown paper-wrapped object and an umbrella on the doorstep. He nodded toward the bundle and remarked, "I didn't want it wet." I moved to make room for him. He gave me the package after shaking the wetness from his coat in the hallway. He said, "It's nothing big." I thought, well, it reminded me of you when I saw it the other day. It took me a while to open it. With presents, I never do. I put on the kettle instead. He trailed me into the kitchen, now accustomed to the route but yet wary, as if each visit still involved a request for forgiveness, whether he was aware of it or not. Steam rose as we sat at the table with 2 cups each. It brought back memories of early mornings. I packed his lunch while he gulped cereal while wearing his uniform and carrying his school bag over one shoulder. Even though he had become more reserved and silent, he still had aspects of the youngster, such as the way his eyes moved while he looked for the proper words and the way he tapped his finger against the mug's rim. He remarked, "I've been thinking a lot lately. That picture." I sipped my tea without uttering a word. Give space to the silence. He went on, "I don't remember that day the way you probably do. I recall the cake, the mess. However, I don't recall seeing you in the photo." I gave a small smile. Sometimes that's the way it is. We only see what is intended for us at that moment. He gave a nod. "Claire made a statement the other evening. Have I ever made room for you to be seen?" she asked. "Not only did they welcome you, they created room for you." I gave him a look. "What did you say, too?" I was unsure of how to respond. At least be honest. Pulling a little square from his coat pocket, he did so. An image print. It was a fresh picture of the same scene, reprinted and reframed, not the one I had handed him. He moved it over the table. He remarked, "I now carry this in my wallet." I handled it lightly. Compared to the original copy I carried, the image was sharper, the color had been adjusted, and the blue frosting was once again vibrant. However, the passion and the gravity of the situation remained unchanged. "You've made a change," I remarked quietly. He gave a nod. However, I still remember where it originated. We sat silently for a long time. Softly, the rain pattered against the glass. As usual, the hall clock ticked away. Then I recalled the package. I gently unwrapped it, placing the tape properly and folding the brown paper precisely. There was a book inside, a selection of poems. Not brand new, used, the kind having a cover of fabric, its spine softer with age. He remarked, "I saw it in the window. I recalled that you once wrote things in the margins." I pulled the cover open. He had penned the following line in the first page's corner. "Now I see you." That's all. No signature, no date. However, I was aware of its gravity. He remained for an additional hour. We discussed nearly nothing, including recipes, the nighttime noise generated by the pipes, and a neighbor's cat that had taken up residence on my porch. However, his presence no longer felt theatrical. It didn't seem like a requirement. I escorted him to the door as he departed. "I'll be back next week," he replied, giving me a little peck on the cheek, "if you don't mind." "It is," I said. With his umbrella tilted slightly against the breeze, I watched him stroll along the walkway. He turned and briefly lifted a hand as he came to the end of the lane. I returned the wave. I set the book on the table inside, the picture next to it. I then brewed a fresh pot of tea, because I wanted to stay in that moment a bit longer, not because anyone was arriving. As usual, the chair by the window waited. However, I stopped pondering what I had done incorrectly. I had remained. I had recalled. And I hadn't vanished in the process. Not from the pictures, not from his life, not from me.